Hello, my name is Scott, and welcome to our Curriculum Design in a Multilingual Era presentation. I'll be joined by Dinguye, Shuran, Yashin, and Suche. We'll be talking about our renewed awareness and new understanding of the social, cultural, and political aspects of curriculum design in our respective contexts. We'll be focusing on the elementary school or primary school sector. We'll also be having a discussion regarding our willingness to make pragmatic changes based on our new understandings. I'll begin by discussing English language teaching in my context, giving you a brief overview of my experiences in working as an ALT in Japan, and investigating the social, cultural, and political factors regarding English curriculum in Japan. Dinguye and Shuren will then talk about the most recent policy changes regarding curriculum in China. They'll be sharing their viewpoints and discussing student agency. Yashin and Shuche will then talk about cultural aspects of English curriculum design in China. And finally, we'll be discussing our willingness to make pragmatic changes based on these new understandings. So, I worked as an ALT as part of the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program, or JET program. I taught in Kunitachi, which is a suburb of West Tokyo. I taught in a music, public, middle and secondary school. Part of my role was providing assistance for supervisor teachers by planning teaching materials and participating in extracurricular activities. So how proficient are Japanese high schoolers in 2020? According to the English First Proficiency Test, Japan is considered to be a country with low proficiency, sitting at 55th in world ranking. This low score is indicative of other countries in Asia, of course. The exception at the moment is, of course, China's rise in English proficiency. They are currently sitting 38 in the world, and that's considered to be quite moderate in proficiency. On a political level, leaders like Prime Minister Shinzo Abe have maintained that English language acquisition is important in staying competitive in a globalized era. Therefore, Japan's central government has a strong control over public education and has been attempting to make drastic changes to the education system. Targeting the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, the full-scale development of English education started back in 2014. So, what will the changes look like? The government of Japan have introduced a number of measures to reform its education system. English will be introduced as a formal subject starting from the 5th grade in 2020. There will be new English familiarization curricula to be adopted from 3rd grade, and an increase in the number of assistant language teachers, or ALTs, to participate in English instruction classrooms. According to the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, or MEXT, the English Education Reform Plan corresponds to this idea of globalization. It looks to promote students' awareness of the necessity of English in a globalized society and stimulating the motivation in English learning by providing students with more opportunities to use English through effective utilization of ALTs, ICTs and other means. So what do these changes mean for the elementary school system? Elementary schools will be developing new and challenging curricula that utilizes professionally produced textbooks. There'll be an increase in classes aimed at developing communicative English skills. Students will be exposed to about 700 English words with an increased number of English phrases. And there will be an adoption of an oral skills only curriculum and other teaching approaches such as learner-centeredness and communicative language teacher, with an interest on deep and active learning as the goal.
So I'm Sharon. I'm going to talk about the impacts of policies in China's primary school curriculum reform, as well as what has been changed in the English curriculum. So as we can see there are two major periods of curriculum reform. The first one is from 1949 to 2001. During this period, the government basically regulates the study materials and curriculum in each area in the country. So it is relatively uncommon for English to students to study English in primary school during this period. But in 1999, English subject were introduced for first-year primary school students in some cities in China, such as Beijing and Shanghai. And now we move on to the second period. It's from 2001 until now. It is sharing-based curriculum administration. So in this period, China's curriculum administration was moving away from straight centralization. The policy stressed that curriculum content should be coordinated with students' life experiences, and independent, exploratory, and collaborative learning are encouraged. Thus, students are given a dominant role in their education. So in 2001, the Chinese Ministry of Education announced that English is a compulsory subject from the third year of primary education. So students now in primary schools, they have to learn English. And now, also there are some recent introduced policy. Ding Ye will talk more about this in her part. So welcome, Ding Ye.
Thanks, Shuran. I want to talk about these three underlying factors that influence language curriculum in the context of primary education in China. So China's Ministry of Education has issued a new policy on education and training institutions. It bans them from being listed on the stock market and allows them to conduct training during holidays and summer vacations, which has sent the share prices of domestic first-line education and training institutions plummeting. So the next slide, please. Yes, yes. So the issue is, what do you think about this policy, and does it have a positive effect on students' English learning? What do you think?
Okay, so I reckon this policy is good because all children do not need to go to makeup lessons on weekends, and everyone can stand on the same starting line. Students can only participate in interest classes, and they will have less pressure. It is a relaxation for both their body and mind. And also this policy alleviates the phenomenon of internalization of education, which means irrelational internal competition. So no student can get more benefits from academic extracurriculum classes. So the education will become more equal to everyone. It has a significant effect on education development in China.
Yes, however, I agree with you, but I think the voice of WeMedia and other social media like Weibo and Zhihu in China use the critical thinking to help the public analyze the situation from another perspective. In the case of compulsory diversion of 50% of students from the junior high school students to vocational college, and they are now unable to go to the educational institutions. So one-to-one lessons have become the choice of more parents. Therefore, the final victims are still the class with scarce education resources because they do not have the more money to hire tutors. As long as the selection systems through examinations remains unchanged, the competition in education will continue and become more serious. So
Yeah.
I think it has a negative effect on students' English learning, and for the curriculum design, I think the student agency will demote the English learning for themselves.
Yeah, you may.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Dingye and Shuran. Next part, Yaxing and I will discuss the issue that for primary students is fostering intercultural community competence necessary in the second language curriculum. Yaxing, do you have any idea?
Yes, I think culture is important in language learning. The culture possesses people behaviors, attitudes that can help people respect the cultural differences between themselves and others. And raising cultural awareness is important in the language learning. Students can recognize culture and develop respect with others. Interacting and emphasizing with different ideas also reflect on intercultural experiences. One of the effective teaching methods in the language curriculum is intercultural communication. Some activities that can foster intercultural understanding, such as celebrate specific festivals, make connections with communities, and go on field trips. An educator as a facilitator of intercultural understanding can promote students' positive values and attitudes and build their intercultural communication competence.
I agree. And also Gardner's social educational model attempts to theorize the social component in second language learning. This model focuses on second language learning in educational setting and views the learning process as the acquisition of symbolic elements of different linguistic communities and the reassessment of self-identity. The model assumes that the social and cultural environment in which learners grow up determines their beliefs about language and culture, which means it determines their attitudes towards the learning environment as a whole, and thus the extent to which they wish to identify with the target language culture. Therefore, I think language learners' attitude to the culture of the target language can impact their willingness in the process of second language acquisition. And cultural identity is an internal choice, right? And not something that can be imposed from the outside and make people voluntary to learn and understanding the language from another culture. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. I think also in the process of language acquisition, there is a special area of the brain that is complex in terms of language input and output. The Broca area, which begins to develop between the ages of 2 and 4 and closes down automatically after the age of 12. The learning of a foreign language after the age of 12 is therefore like storing language in the memory area, so that knowledge of the language is more rigid during this period. And when expressions of thought are not directly imitated from the native language area, but have to be acquired by going around to the skill area, which is the tradition English and Chinese translation.
Oh, so in that case, the development of core language literacy is an important element in the early language acquisition process, which requires the curriculum to be designed to emphasize the development of cultural awareness or literacy and develop their language literacy. And this provides a theoretical basis for the teaching objects or the targets or goals, and teaching strategies used in the curriculum. And however, I found that the monolingual and monocultural bias may hinder the identification with the target language and culture. This monolingual bias refers to the need to abandon the first language and culture in order to learn the second language and culture to adapt to another native group. And they believe the people who are who have the monolingual bias, they believe this kind of abandonment is described as cultural integration or integrative attitudes by other people.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. I think at this stage, we've all had our chance to speak about our experiences, discussion, with look at some slides that will link it to some of the literature that we're learning about. So I'm going to frame it in terms of my own experiences in teaching in Japan, but that does not mean that these things are perhaps relevant in your perspective. So if you want to speak about some of these elements, please go ahead. I was an ALT in Japan. From my own experiences, I certainly felt like a tape recorder from time to time because I was just there to help with their pronunciation. very passive learning, not integrated, certainly not what you would call communicative language teaching. Anyways, so other problems in the curriculum design, certainly textbooks, which you've all sort of touched on. Textbooks are seen as a major source of cultural and ideology, and what is taught through textbooks is highly selective. So from my experience looking at textbooks in Japan, they tried to tell stories from all parts of the world, but it was certainly the English speaking world in particular, and they've always been scrutinized for being too American and Americanized. And I was also almost seen as an American, and which I'm not. I'm an Australian, and they really love to hear about those cultural differences. So they have a thirst. The students should have an awareness of the diversity, not only through the English speaking world, but throughout the world and cultures in general. Otherwise, they'll just always see you as an American. Huh? So this stuff that I read came from a book called The Role of English Teaching in Modern Japan by Meiko Yamada. So that just relays the idea of diversity and cultural backgrounds. Pragmatic changes that I would make: curriculum extension by reading. In our readings I came across in the Mikan texts, the idea of learner autonomy. So in increased language awareness in primary school, certainly what I would like to do is to start curriculum extension by reading books. There were a few English books in the elementary school where I taught, but I would really boost that. If you really want to make a go of English literacy, those sort of programs must be in place. Authentic communication in the classroom, utilizing the assistant language teachers more effectively. There needs to be, certainly I felt like a drill instructor or even a tape recorder. Just set phrases. My story didn't matter. I was reading from a textbook. So the idea of learners being more active participants in dialogues for increased learner autonomy is something that we came across in the Van Leer's Interaction in the Language curriculum. Finally, I just thought I'd show a picture of my family in Japan. What kind of English speakers will Japanese people become? Will they be Japanese speakers of English, or will they be automatons who have been too influenced by American culture? What was the most effective strategy in your learning?
Most effective way?
Yeah, so did you learn from a textbook? Did you learn in English conversation? How did you learn?
Actually, in our primary school, we learn from textbook. That's because we need to focus on the examination. But
Okay.
For the future study, like before we come to university, we need to pass the IELTS test. We need to go, wow, so cute. We need to go to college, to live in another country. So we need to learn English in the conversation or in,
That's an interesting point. And certainly the socialization element comes in there. It's very hard to learn in a country that has such a monolingual sort of society, in fact. And certainly my partner, she's Japanese, and she learned all through high school. And it wasn't until she actually was placed in Australia, sat on the back of a bus and heard children talk to one another, when she freaked out and realized that she doesn't know English at all. So it is that socialization. And it always speaks to the literature that we're reading about. So in our design, we really need to focus on designing with that socialization in mind, and certainly that would help in terms of engagement. But yeah, that's a really good point. I think often the case, people have these really culturally enriching experiences in socialization by actually going to countries that have a predominance of English speaking.
And I have one more question. I think it's out of the discussion. It's like,
Right.
Do you think the policy, or the one direction from the policy from the government to school or education system or as educational institution, is that kind of pressure? Because I can see it's highly controlled, but I can see it's pressure. What do you think about that? I know China and Japan, actually they're kind of similar about the policy. So
because I'm an Australian, I don't want to answer that question. I've asked my partner, who's Japanese, what do you think of these cultural changes in Japan? What does that mean for your identity? Traditionally, and I don't know if I speak for China, but Japan was very internalized, but since then have actually actively gone out and ventured out into the world in terms of globalization. That is probably because of their productivity over the decades, manufacturing and things like that. I mean, they're a very powerful nation economically. They really want to stretch this idea of globalization, but I don't really think they understand what that literally means. They're going to become very Americanized. And what does that mean for the unique Japanese culture? So I put the question to you. I'm an Australian. I think cultural identity is a very different question. We're an English speaking country, but we're very open in terms of immigration. I'm not sure if Japan has the same sentiment.
It's also hard for me to answer this kind of question. It's like, we need to keep our to keep our traditional or cultural things in our mind, and we need to open our eye and to look at the world, and to establish a right way to look at the world. But what is the right way? Nobody can see that.
That's right. Look, when I read about these new curriculum changes in Japanese schools, straight away I'm like, fantastic opportunities for me to gain employment and develop my career and all these great things. At the same time, it's a very interesting time in our lives. So we're seeing these rapid changes. And I think it's something that we perhaps can't answer in this discussion, but it was fun talking to you guys. So thank you very much. All the best in your studies. I'll see you soon. Okay.